Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and great having you here, honorable guests. I welcome you on behalf of the Austrian Nationalbank to the event of financing the economic transition to net zero. As you know, this event is jointly organized with the European Investment Banker, who traditionally presents also the investment survey at the Austrian National Bank. Deborah, welcome here. To say you almost have a guest room here, because fortunately we are lucky that you like to come to Austria like that. What will be presented is an EU-wide survey, and where the European Investment Banker gathers qualitative and quantitative information on firms' investment activities. This survey is a useful basis for the analysis also at macro level and allows available sector and country comparison. I think that's important. And Deborah just gave me the report. It's very happy. That's the reason I didn't take it here. You're all invited to carefully go it through. The chief economist of the European Investment Bank, Deborah Watella, who is here, will present the most recent findings also on Austria. So you will have two reports, one which is for Europe and one is specifically for Austria. This presentation will be followed then by a panel discussion on the question of financing the transition to net zero in Austria. And here we'll hear from leading experts in the field who will share this practical experience and nights. And I will somewhat deviate from the remarks prepared for me. And also we see here my predecessor, Governor Novotny, who also was here a couple of days ago on Monday, when we had this afternoon session, when I was sitting here leading a panel where something interesting has been said. And so let me deviate because I found it great. Because the question with central banks is always, okay, what's the role in it? What's the role of a central bank in the net zero there? And they're both a national central bank, but also the IMF, who was there on Monday to celebrate 100 years of not 100 years, not yet, 80 years of Bretton Woods and 75 years of the Austrian National Bank being a member of the IMF. And here the question a question came up, what is the role of central banks there? And in the international discussion at the IMF, this is linked to the question of macro criticality. What is macro critical? Okay. Well, many things, or almost all things, in some extent, macro critical, you know, be it equity, big gender, big whatever it is. Now, the question is climate something which is ultra macro critical? And the assessment of the panel was, yes, it is. And so the question was whether, to say, the IMF in the future should, from this point of view, have more engagement than in other areas which, how to say, are important, can be looked at somewhat at national level if and as it matters. But the environment is something which is really important. And so during the discussion, things came out. I'm sure we will discuss soon at the IMF in Washington, the spring meeting. The question is whether is this something which has the importance of balance of payment issues? So for which the IMF has the central mandate there. Is it something, given the size and the need of financing which is needed, is so important that the IMF should put a real focus on it at the level of financing gaps which emerge from balance of payments disequilibrium? And if this is the case, would this not require that additional funding of the size what we currently have as well as the question, wouldn't then be important to have a climate financial market survey program? This is something which came out there. I just wanted to mention it to put it into your mind. I found it fascinating because if this were to be, it would be a breakthrough. Whether this happens, I don't know. Now, I go back to my prepared rules there to have to go through it because you want to have your panel. So I already talked about why it is important to have it and why we are all involved there, the volatility, whatever it is. But micro, and one point, I think from the micro point of view, why it is important is because climate and the financing of the climate will have also an effect of the natural interest rate, so the rate, this mystic rate, which determines, how to say, our monetary stance. And if and as, how to say, it requires a lot of investment and financing, it will definitely influence it. And why is the effective interest rate so important? Well, at the moment, if it remains low, the lower bound will become or will remain perhaps binding, and we will be constrained to stay within our monetary policy part of it. So climate, micro, and monetary policy are closely linked. But of course, what we will have is that the shocks, the climate shocks will differ from region to region. It is, and what also is that the climate change also will have a differential effect on our balance sheet. Balance sheet, you recall, last week we had a press conference in which we, presented our balance sheets, and it emerged there that it has a major negative level created by our monetary policy. But of course, if we get engaged, we want to make sure also that our balance sheet will not be hurt by an additional task, which could be climate, and still remain negative. So this is something of these elements which matter, and that's the reason why we're a bit careful. Central bankers are typically a bit more careful than, individuals from research institutions who can think broadly, because we have something which is very valuable to defend, which is the belief and the support of individuals in our common currency. So, given this kind of assets, what have we been doing so far? Well, we have, I think, strengthened importantly our capabilities to take climate consideration into account of our macroeconomic analysis when we form our policy decisions. And one of the decisions was yesterday, as you will heard, no change, but a change maybe in preparation. We employ new models to identify them. And I think central banks are in the forefront of relevant modeling about climate change and effects on the economy. There are a number of my international colleagues that have established really first-class, cutting-edge research groups of dealing with it. Canada, for example, is one of these institutions. Then we ran also climate test stress, which we started out only a couple of years ago, where we investigate, essentially, where we try to learn what kind of models can be useful for us in order to say when we run into financial issues through the climate, and the question is then how to react to it, what would be the best instrument there. And here we are, more the followers, not the leaders of what the policy decides, what kind of instrument should be applied. And from October 22 to July 23, we titled our investments on corporate bonds towards the issue of them. A problem always is you earmark a certain financial instruments, you prefer them, not prefer them. It is great if you expand your balance sheet, but as we now want to reduce it, then you have also to sell favored assets then, which of course then has a negative impact then, but you don't want to do monetary policy in order to support the support there. So we knew this before, but it creates some issues there. And in the future, only assets of EU corporate sustainability reporting reports will remain eligibility under the collateral framework. So only a few earmarked assets will be there, which will be bought under this program. Trying to have also too many assets there has proven that it is not best way to run. So then a little bit on financing the green transition, about the size of it. We have the European Commission estimates of more than 620 billion euros per year, which are needed to finance an environmental climate. This is quite a lot of money, and the question where the money is coming from is something which will certainly be the key discussion element of the years to come. Now, before we decide how to finance the green transition, of course, we have to make sure that we know what investments projects do we have there. And this leads us to something to say, okay, what is the kind of technology we would like to have? Now, I would be hugely tempted to get into a discussion about what kind of technology we think it's useful or not. I just did an interview where also this question was asked. I won't do it, but I think this is something where much more discussion has to take place. For the moment, I have the feeling it's a bit too one-sided. And when we talk then about what kind of investments in what direction we should do, then the question of course happens, what is the way how to do it? How much we should use the prices in order to guide these decisions, or how much we should choose political foresights to do it. So, as you may have learned, and some of you may have participated, already about a year ago here at the Austrian Nationalbank, we started a small open seminar series to inform us about the different technical issues about climate change. And it emerged because as a simple economist, I thought, oh, only the economists are not green. Now it's a translation from German with each other when it concerns what approach should be done. But the technical people, the physicists, and they know it well. When I found out it's not the case, also they have big differences. And since I wanted to be informed about the differences, we decided to have a little seminar series where we invited people to come in and always have a, not confrontational, but a balanced discussion about it. Role of e-fuel, for example, was one of the topics. Or another topic what we had is, in Austria, this is of course almost, close to you may lose your citizenship when you dare to talk about nuclear energies, that's even if you talk about new ones, not only the old ones. And we still have two sessions open where we will talk next time about diffusion technology. Where is it? When can we hope that it will be there? And the other one is also to get more information where hydrogen as an energy carrier, what is the prospect there? So invitation, so if you have not yet received the invitation, happy to invite you there. And only then we move into the question of what are the instruments to best use. We made an exception and invited Hans Werner Sinn for different reasons to do only something there. So in order to do it, so you see, central banks are heavily involved in this topic. We are not the leader, but I think we need to remain involved in order to understand what this kind of decisions we have to make. Here I don't want to be only a price taker. I want to have our own views on it. And so what you do today, it's important for us. It enlightens me again a little bit more. I will stay here for some time, half an hour. Afterwards I have to do something else. I wish us all an interesting discussion. We have a great panel. And after that, all the best, and enjoy the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's really always a pleasure to be back here. And I'm happy to know that I have a guest room here at the Central Bank. I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's very interesting actually what we just heard in terms of the role of central banks in understanding what is happening with the climate transition and what is the role that they need to play. At the European Investment Bank, I think it's clear the role we have to play. We are the EU Climate Bank, among others, and we are trying to see how we can support the transformation of our economy. In the report that I'm presenting today, we are actually presenting two reports. One is our annual investment report that is is a focus on financing a transition, transformative investment. And the idea that we have behind is that the economy is transforming. We know all the transformation that we have in place. We have the net zero transition. We have digitalization, artificial intelligence are changing our economy. We have a process of, I don't want to call it deglobalization. I think it's a working on resilience of supply chains. And then we have the underlying process of aging population that also requires our thinking of how the world of work will be and how to include also the social dimension into whatever we do for transforming our economy. And all of this requires a lot of investment. All this transition, we are in a changing world. And when the world changes, all this transition requires investment. But the concern that we have is that this time around, we come from a series of shocks, the pandemic, the energy shock. The good news is that we come out from this series of shock and investment has been much more resilient than what we have seen in the past, at the time of the global financial crisis or the sovereign debt crisis. But then if we look forward, we think, will this investment remain? And we see that there are concerns on the public sector playing its role in the long term, on the private sector that will have to play a very important role in terms of financing all this transition, how to make it more, the intervention more catalytic, having a more private sector involvement. So these are all the concerns. Coming from a good story, investment needs remain huge. Investment has performed relatively well, but what's next? And that's exactly what I will try to put forward with my presentation. What I was saying, we are presenting the investment report. We are also presenting a survey that we do every year on European firms, including Austrian firms. So you also see the analysis of Austrian firms. And when I present, I try to merge a little bit what we see at the European level with the Austrian data. So I start with the first message that I had, and it's probably the good message. The last time, and that's the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, it took a long time for investment to recover. European level, the first graph, Ireland excluded for the usual one-off effect, but you see how long it took the recovery of investment. And then if you look at this time, actually was quite quick. And was quite quick, the recovery of all components. Of course, we had households fast, government played a very strong role, but also corporate investment recovered quite fast. On the Austrian case, we see the recovery much better than the last time, but we still see very strong the recovery on the government side and the household component, a bit less on the corporate side, actually definitely less on the corporate side. But the EU story is a positive story. The Austrian story, still on the corporate side, has something to do in terms of recovery of investment. I understand that looking granular data, there is a good component on the corporate side on the R&D part, so the part that is probably very important also in this moment in the transformation of the economy, but still corporate investment overall is lagging behind in the recovery. But that somehow is a part of the good story. If we have to explain where did it come from, I think there is a very good recognition that the policy response this time was learning from the past, you can call them mistakes. There was a very strong common reaction at the European level. The Recovery and Resilience Facility was giving a background, a common background on transforming the economy as the central of policy response. And also what came as a surprise lately was also the fact that household and corporate had a lot of buffers that could use in part of the recovery. So that's part of the story that we had. Then on the public sector, also in terms of public sector investment, what we saw is actually that this time around, the public sector investment is also reacting in a different way. Again, we compare this shock, pandemic and energy shock, compared to the average of past crises. And what you see is the blue line, okay, there is some very, very marginal stabilization on public investment compared to the peak, but then it's performing much, much better than in past crises. So the strong focus on public investment going on remains. What is interesting is that the public investment was also kind of catalytic, if you want. And what we are looking at, and that's coming from our survey of European firms, we try to look at, so we have various questions to firms, and one of the questions is whether firms are receiving grants or subsidies. And then we know what the firms do in terms of investment in the various areas. What you see is actually that the public support that was transferred to firms somehow had also some positive effect in terms of transformation. So in fact, subsidies helped the firms to invest in R&D, to invest in innovation, clean technology, energy efficiency, and green implementation. Sometimes we claim that subsidies were not always very well targeted. They should have even been more targeted, but somehow they push firms in the right direction in terms of action. That's, and those, are European level information. When we look at what happened to the Austrian firms, I think what we saw, and it's part of the good story, there are a lot of factors that represent a challenge for the Austrian firms. We have seen that 95% of firms in Austria are telling us that they experienced supply chain disruption. They were exposed to high energy prices, and we show more detail. Actually, it's a very high the share of firms complaining in Austria. They were also exposed to weather events impacting their business. That's quite high also at the European level as a complaint. And they also see risk from the net zero transition. But Austrian firms were also using the last year as an opportunity to transform. We see the pickup of investment in energy efficiency and the pickup in use of advanced digital digital technology. And there is still some 14% of Austrian firms that they tell us that they invested too little. But in general, I think the story of using those years somehow to transform in front of the huge challenges there for the Austrian firms as well. And if we compare Austrian firms to European firms, actually there is kind of some Austrian firms are still investing in measures to build the resilience, changing searching strategies. They are using advanced digital technology and are currently investing. So, in fact, on a structural point of view, Austrian firms seems to be well positioned in some of the transitions that we are discussing. But the challenge ahead remain important. That's what I was saying at the beginning. So the story so far is not too bad, but what's happening looking forward. And I think the main point that we have is always this graph that we started monitoring a few years ago. And it's this gap in terms of what you could call it a productive investment. In fact, is machinery and equipment, intangible, and infrastructure investment. We take out the residential real estate component. And what you see is this gap opening between the European Union and United States is a 2 percentage point of gap accumulating year after year. What is worrisome is not only the 2% per year, but such a long time with much less investment in the productive part of the economy. If you decompose it, private public sector, you see that there is a big component also coming from the private sector. So that's quite interesting to look at. And with this gap, I think we have various ways to look at the investment needs. You could do it bottom-up, coming sector by sector, where you see the gap in terms of investment. And the governor was just mentioning the estimates from the Commission of Investment Needs for the net zero transition. But in general, I think we have to consider this need for the transformation of the economy and the transformation of investment. And again, the topics are the net zero transition, the innovation and digitalization part, the building the resilience for the value chain, but also there is a huge component that you could call associated to the social dimension. And here, I think it's important to think that inequality is not only good for fairness. Inequality can be good in the current context, also in terms of productivity and potential growth. And the reason is that skills is the major impediment for firms all over Europe since more than a decade. So investing in skills, investing in the workforce, and also somehow in enlarging the workforce participation, and sometimes it has also to do with investment in infrastructure, in care. That is something quite important also for European productivity. And I think the social dimension is very important to look at, particularly in this area that links the skills part, labor force participation to the productivity part. So with all this investment need, I try looking at, in the report, we look a lot about climate and the energy challenge, a bit with the data that we get from the survey, but also with other analysis. And I will try to give you a couple of messages of where we think the concerns are. The first part looks at the energy shock when it appeared. So it came as an energy shock, was very much perceived at the European and the Austrian level. We asked to firms how much if they perceive the increase of energy prices and also a quantification of the increase. As you see, Austrian firms are among those that really perceived strong increases, higher than 25%, even more than the EU level. What is interesting is the comparison with the US. We know it, but looking at the data, the fact that this increase more than 25% was almost negligible in the US and so strong in Europe is something interesting to look. In terms of responses, a lot of energy saving and energy efficiency investment, and we saw in the Austrian side before that there was a lot of pick-up on energy efficiency investment as well. But also pass cost to final customers, and I think that was also a feature both in the US and at the European and Austrian level that we see in terms of the survey. One interesting analysis that we were trying to do, and this is developed at the European level, was to look at what energy cost and actually uncertainty do to firm propensity to invest for energy efficiency and climate action. So the distinction is energy efficiency is a kind of a time of high energy prices is kind of a no-brainer. If you can invest something and reduce the consumption, you see immediately the effect. Climate action investment is more complex. It includes not only the energy efficiency part, but the whole of the mitigation and adaptation framework. So it's more than the short-term return. You really have to transform your business thinking at the future. What do we see? We see that firms that tell us that they are concerned about energy costs. So energy costs push firms to invest more, both in energy efficiency and in climate action. When you add uncertainty, the interaction between energy costs and uncertainty plays a strange game. So firms still keep incentive to invest for the short term, the energy efficiency side. But for climate action, the effect becomes non-significant and actually goes very low. And in fact, it means that the firms' uncertainty can dilute the effect of the pressure of high energy prices on the transformation for firms. And that's very important when you have to define policy action, because whatever uncertainty you put on the path of the net zero transition can really change the incentive for firm for moving forward in the transformation. There is a positive story, if you want. Uncertainty has a lower effect in slashing back climate investment in the energy-intensive industry. And that's probably because the energy-intensive industry, in particular, they are under more pressure for transformation, being in the ETS, being in a process which is kind of more binding in terms of the need to transform. But this basically, it's a more economic analysis, if you want, but I think it's very important in giving the feeling, the feeling of the damage that uncertainty can bring to the net zero transition when you look at the incentive for firms. Always, and going a bit more in the same direction, we look at two piece of study. Once we look at firms that operate in the ETS market, and we look at the effect of carbon price in the story of the ETS market. And then what we see is that actually carbon price has an important effect in pushing firms to decarbonize on the one side, but also to invest in research and development. So in fact, what we see with the data is that being in the ETS and the effect of the progressive tightening of the ETS brings firms to invest and to transform. We do a second kind of analysis, that's the first. The second part of the analysis looks at specifically at the firms in the manufacturing sector that operate in sectors that are covered by the ETS. And here we ask firms to self-define as leaders and laggards in the decarbonization process. And then we check whether it's true. So we look whether the leaders are really decarbonizing faster. But then what comes very interesting is that leaders are much more likely to invest to cut emissions, are much more likely to innovate, and to have a plan for future innovation in terms of decarbonization. Laggards are more likely to tell us that they underinvested in terms of the decarbonization and are more likely to reduce in net term production capacity. So what we are worried with this is that we see that there is a kind of a decarbonization divide emerging, with a group of firms that play on the opportunity related to the decarbonization process. They try to be first in class, they innovate, they advance, and we get market opportunities. There are other firms that are actually playing the other game. They don't do anything, they try to keep as is, but by doing so, they really underinvest, they don't innovate, and slowly reduce production capacity. The concern we have is that at a certain point, it may become too difficult for the laggard to jump in the good train. So the concern is really, on the policy point of view, you have to set incentive very well, not to give incentive to the laggard to stay a little bit longer in the wrong path, but actually try to convert them as soon as possible to the good part before it's too late. And there is one element, I don't show it. All firms of those that we interview, they tell us, so 90% of the firms, the good and the bad, the leader and the laggards, tell us uncertainty kills us, kill every possible decision to invest in decarbonization. It's clear because on the good part, if you are uncertain on the policies, you don't know if the market you are betting on will be the right one, so you delay investment. If you are on the bad path, and they tell you, you may stay there, okay, we told you that we are tightening a rule, but maybe we give you 10 years more, and the amortization of your factory is 5 years, you don't do anything. So at the end, very clear regulatory path and policy direction in terms of decarbonization, I think is really crucial for all firms. But with this analysis, we really wanted to put the accent on the risk of this decarbonization divide and the importance of very clear policy direction to avoid the laggards to be out of the market at a certain point. Another thing I wanted to show, and I apologize, these large SME are a leftover from something else. What I wanted to show is something else. In the survey, we ask firms if they perceive the net zero transition as a risk or as an opportunity. I find it interesting something, and this is, you see, the EU, Austria, and also on the right side, we see the dynamic for Austria. What you see is that firms tend to increase in awareness, so the no impact is going down fast. What is increasing is both the perceiving it as an opportunity and as a risk. It's interesting because we have other analysis showing that if you ask this question to firms and then you ask if they are investing for the net zero transition in mitigation measure, the ones that are really investing are those seeing the opportunity. That's the first. So you see an opportunity, you see the new market, you are probably a new company or something, you are betting on this and you start investing very much. The second group is the one seeing the risk. It's a difficult investment because probably you have to transform, etc. But it's the second group. The one that really don't do much are those that see no impact, and that could be two things. Maybe there is really no impact, or maybe they are not aware. So the awareness part also plays a role. But it's interesting that in Austria there is a lot of firms that start seeing also the opportunity. It's a good news because it means that they will invest and try to catch the market opportunity. Innovation. So I close the net zero, the net zero transition story with the key message being importance of policy direction, importance of the policy signal behind, and certainty on the policy direction, and the risk of this decarbonization divide that I think it's important to take care of. Then we look at the innovation activities. In the innovation side, I think the report has a nice chapter that if you are interested to look at, I just point to two key messages, probably, actually three key messages on that point of view. We come to the point of saying, so I think the diagnostic of the innovation market in Europe is well known by now. Europe has some, if you want, still maintains some position in terms of innovation, but particularly in terms of patenting, lost in certain areas that are the most dynamic one. The positive story is that on green innovation, there is still some leadership. But I think the graph that really tells you the story is the one that I'm showing here. We look every year at this list of the top 2,500 world spenders in terms of research and development. And here, the interesting part is something we calculated is new to the club. So firms that entered the group of these top R&D innovators in the last years. And what you see is that Europe is very small there. So in fact, what is really the point, I think, is that Europe fails to create the new ones. So it's a relatively static environment where bringing firms in the growth phase to become one of the leading innovators is difficult. Why is it particularly important now? Because we have a huge opportunity on the climate transition, on the net zero transition part. We are good in terms of patenting and innovation, still at the European level, challenged, but still good. And we have an opportunity because we have a framework, also legislative framework in terms of policies that is better than other parts. We have a more clear path to go. So on this side, particularly on the net zero innovation part, we really have an opportunity that we have to play well. But then it comes what are the constraints in terms of innovation in Europe. I think at the EIB, we work a lot with innovation. I think we come to the point that one key area where there is a very strong market needs is in the part of scaling up of firms. So there is a particular phase in the growth of firms where firms get into bottlenecks, and also the funds are not big enough to allow these firms to support these firms. So that is something where on the policy point of view, we also put a big accent, and all comes back to the Capital Market Union. That is the big topic that I think everybody is trying to bring back more concrete with more initiative. But for us, really the scaling up part of a firm and supporting this group of firms is very important. And particularly important now because we have this opportunity related to the innovation and the net zero transition. In terms of digitalization, advanced digitalization, something good on the Austrian side, there seems to be good investment, good adoption, of advanced digital technologies for Austrian firms. I think advanced robotic, digital platforms, but you see big data, you see that Austria is actually positioning relatively well compared to the EU average, but also compared to the US in many things. So in terms of industrial adoption of digitalization, the results are not bad. I come to the last point, overcoming a barrier, and I think that's another very important part. We think always at what can be done for the net zero transition, for investment in general, net zero transition, innovation, but it always comes back out what is constraining firms. So we look at, and this year we are reporting whether firms face a certain barrier to investment, and you see that EU and Austria level, you always have the kind of the same barrier that are up there. Energy cost, we already talked about it. I think the availability of skills is a particularly strong barrier. Also in Austria, particularly strong. What is interesting is that the availability of skills is a barrier both for the firms that are, so for all firms, but then it's particularly constraining for the best firms, for those that innovate, for those that invest and invest in the net zero transition. So in fact, it's blocking the frontier of firms in their evolution. So it's really something that we think that has to be addressed, both in terms of labor force participation, but also in terms of really the skills that are deployed. What we did this year was trying to do an experiment and trying to look at, so we ask firms if they face barriers, and then we know what their investment ratio is. We try to do some econometric analysis, and we have a nice paper on it that shows that if you remove one major barrier for the firms that is saying it has one major barrier, if you remove it, the average investment intensity of the firm goes from around 9% to around 10%. So it's a 1 percentage point up. It's an exercise, but it tells you that really barriers matter. So from the econometric analysis, you see this effect in terms of removing barriers and more investment intensity for firms. I focus on the last two messages, the going forward. So going forward, I think definitely removing the barriers can have a positive effect on investment. The second concern is related to public investment. So we come from a good story of public investment, of investment in general and public investment. We all know that it's difficult to keep public investment going in period of consolidation. It may not be the case in all countries, but there are countries that may come with some trade-off in the next year. Maybe not immediately. Immediately, in many countries, the Recovery and Resilience Facility will provide buffers, but we start seeing concern on the fiscal side in some of the countries. And the message that we pass is that in history, whenever there is a consolidation, public investment gets massively slashed, but it also can have an effect on private investment. And we think that having a very strong focus on investment going forward remains important. We don't want this to happen, the contraction in public investment and the contraction in private investment. And the reason why we don't want, because again, because of all the transition that we have, there are a lot of investments that are extremely important, and some are public goods that should come or could easily come from the public sector. I make an example. We have 2 papers in the report looking at the effect of the network, the internet network speed on firm investment at the regional level. If you don't have a good internet speed, firms invest less in digitalization, and also they have a lower return of their investment. So having a good network is really important for firm investment, and we prove it on the data. The same, we look in terms of investment in climate. That's always at the regional level. We look at regional utilization of EU funds for climate purpose and firm investment for climate. And again, we see a relationship. In this case, it's not causality, it's correlation. Maybe a matter of awareness, maybe a matter of needs or whatever thing, but we think that it's important. Sometimes the role of the public sector as a signal is important. As a signal or as a precondition is important. Another example that I think everybody is talking about now is the effectiveness of all the renewable energy investment that we are doing if we don't have a very strong grid behind. So the investment in the grid is kind of a precondition to really get the most of all the renewable investment that is happening at the European level. I finish with a last point, and I think all what I was talking about is physical investment, more or less, and innovation is a part of the intangible. But there is a part related to the social dimension that I think it's extremely important to look at. And I think it's important to look at also not only for equality reasons, but also for productivity reasons. And one side we are thinking about, so all over Europe you have lack of skills. It's the main impediment for all firms, and particularly for the most advanced one. And then at the same time, we also have an aging population. What you see in the first graph is something quite easy to show, but we actually look at the PISA mathematics scores for 15 years old kids coming from least advantaged family and most advantaged families. You see the difference. It's huge. And then we are looking in a market, we are looking for skills for the future, and we don't do anything for that group of kids to bring it up. And I think it's something very, very important. It's not only social equality, it's really productivity, it's really potential output of countries. How do you get much more skill up also from the least advantaged side? And that's one point. The second point, I think it's a rational, maybe you can think about more investment in care, health, kids care, kindergarten or elderly care. Somehow you see the difference of share of employed, women employed with children, without children. It's of course also a choice, it's not many things, but with a lot more investment in care, particularly in some countries, maybe you can close some of these gaps. So on this, the point is a lot of, we talk about competitiveness, we talk about productivity, but there is also a lot related to skills and social investment, social infrastructure investment and social investment that also contributes to the story of competitiveness and productivity. I come to the end. I repeat the main message. We need to support the transformation of our economies, and transformation of our economies require investment that has the various dimensions of supporting the competitive and inclusive society. And I think we are worried on a number of factors. I think one is on the innovation side, keeping the opportunity related to the green innovation potential, and also work on this scale-up finance part. On the decarbonization side, it's the concern that we have on this decarbonization divide that may emerge. On public investment, the importance of delivery on public investment, in the right public investment with effective investment, but also having in mind to maximize the catalytic effect. And here, whenever there are incentives to the private sector to be very much targeted for the transformation that we need, also because the resources are not infinitive, so you have to be targeted to really bring to the objective that you want to achieve. And then I think in all of this, something not only because I'm from the European Investment Bank, but I think the more you do instrument policies at the European level, the more you protect the single market, and that's the upside for Europe overall. Thank you very much.
So, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our panel discussion after Ms. Rivoltella's very interesting insights on your research. We want to continue our debate on how to finance the green transition. Today's topic is financing the investment needs for net zero. Where does Austria stand? Before we start, let me please briefly introduce to you our panelists. Welcome on stage, Mr. Jürgen Schneider, Director General of the Ministry for Climate Action and Energy. New guests not being announced yesterday, Hubert Cottoni, Director and Head of the European Investment Bank Group's office in Austria. Ms. Marion Morales, sorry, I was looking at you first, member of the Management Board of UniCredit Bank Austria. Gabriel Felbermayr, Director of Austrian Institute of Economic Research in Vienna, WIFO. Hello. And Silvia Angelo, Chief Investment Officer of Austrian Railways ÖBB Infrastructure. Hello. Mr. Schneider, I would like to start with you as a representative of a federal ministry. We've heard a lot about uncertainty. On the one hand, we experienced a boom in green technology and expansion of renewable energy sources. In Austria, they make up now 36% of the energy mix, which is quite a lot compared to other European cities, European countries, of course. And on the other hand, after the war in Russia started and the blackmailing by the gas tap, the uncertainties at the energy markets, the explosions of gas and electricity prices, we've also those things have led to a massively increase of our domestic gas production being planned in Molln, for example, and the Waldviertel. So where does Austria stand actually right now? Are we witnessing a small renaissance of fossil fuels and fossil energy sources, or are we still in a green upswing?
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks, first of all, for inviting me here, and thanks for sharing the thoughts of the Ministry for Climate Action with you. I mean, before I try to answer the question, let's look back. Let's look back to the last 2 years after the Russian aggression against the Ukraine, the start of a war on the 24th of February. We saw a supply shock starting with natural gas, skyrocketing prices. And let's be very clear what that was. We had an old promise from the fossil energy industry. And the promise was, we provide you secure, cheap energy. And this promise was broken. We had to do a lot of efforts in 22. And I remember back when we had sleepless nights, we weren't sure if our homes would be able to heat in winter. We were not sure if we would have to, under the Energy Control Act, advise companies to stop production. We had a lot of efforts. We, for instance, purchased a strategic gas reserve, which costs us 4 billion euro, which was an emergency measure, which was necessary. And we also had a lot of supports for households, for companies, in order to cope with the skyrocketing prices. But we are very well assured that besides these emergency measures, there are some systemic measures, and that's bringing forward the energy transition. And the good news is you can do both at the same time. You can talk about emergency measures, but increase the speed of the energy transition. That's exactly what we did. We saw, for instance, in the household sectors that the change rates from fossil heating systems to climate-friendly heating systems doubled from about 20,000 to more than 40,000. We saw a record deployment of solar. We have records also in wind last year. By the way, 23 is the first year since 2 decades that Austria exported energy. And our share in electricity of renewables is 80%. So you see that is working out. But deploying renewables takes time, so there is a second answer to the supply shock and to the risk of relying too strong on Russian gas, and that's diversification. We have done a lot also here in diversification, so looking for alternative supply routes. There's a route from the south, there's one from the west. We also made legislation for that, and we obliged companies to also do their homework and prepare for a possible total disruption of Russian gas supplies. And we also have some discussion on Austrian exploration. I mean, to be very clear, I mean, if you look at the overall picture, the gas consumption at the start of the crisis was around, I think, 90 terawatt hours. The exploration in Austria in 22 was around 6 terawatt hours, which is not bad, but is less than 10% what we need. We have a much more important asset in Austria, and that's the storage facilities. We can store more than our annual consumption in our storage. So our first step was to ensure that the gas storage facilities are filled, and we have a hand on them. Now, we talked to OeNB. We have made some, well, we haven't invested in exploration in Austria in the last 20 years. Why? Because it was economical and viable. Why we are looking now in doing that again? Well, prices have gone up. So the higher the prices, the more you earn by exploration. Now the prices are going down again. We've talked to the firms. We haven't made any final investment decision on that. Nevertheless, if for some time-limited period, and for instance, this field the OeNB seems to have discovered, would provide another 3 or 4 terawatt hours, which is 4 or 5% of our annual consumption. And I would see it as part of a diversification. I mean, I would oppose to have investments which bring us a lock-in and which counteract decarbonization. But for a time-limited period, to have some additional national resources to compensate and to help to diversify if the market decides to do so, and if all the permitting procedures are in place and so on and so forth, it's something to discuss, I would say.
We've heard in the previous presentation a lot about uncertainty, also political uncertainty. The government has put together very ambitious funding packages and programs worth billions for green transition measurements in the industry, in the real estate sector, in the infrastructure and public transport sector. However, this being an election year, we don't know who will be in charge of those programs in the future. So do you fear probably a setback in this very ambitious path to net zero? First on an Austrian level and of course then EU-wide. We also
just
have
looking for my crystal
European
ball here to predict the future. Well, I mean, it's interesting to see how political decisions influence the speed of the transition, and they clearly do. But I would also argue in a limited extent. I mean, I see my friend from the US Embassy. One example, I mean, when President Trump ran for his first term, he announced he would bring the renaissance of coal in the US. Did he manage to do it? No, of course not. He couldn't work against the markets. And if you look at the predictions how coal would be used in the US, it went down under the presidency of Trump in contrast to his promises. Why? Because we have cheaper technologies. The renewable electricity production is now by far the cheapest way to produce electricity. Levelized cost of energy production. I mean, we're talking about nuclear. Look at Hinkley Point C. If you know Hinkley Point C, 36 billion euros. And they seek for a guarantee to sell electricity at 15 cents per kilowatt hour. That's very interesting, 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Even in this crisis now we have prices about 10 cents per kilowatt hour in Austria, and pre-crisis was 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hours. So, I mean, you can go to nuclear, but it comes late, it is expensive, it's uncertain. By the way, in the winter 22-23, we had also concerns about the electricity security of supply, main reason being the French nuclear fleet. They discovered some corrosion in the inner circle. The bad news was they have facilities of the same time. If one facility has this problem, they discovered half of the fleet had the same problem. So we really had hard times and also securing security of supply. So it's not true that fossils and nuclear bring security of supply. To your question, I mean, a lot of the things we need for the transition is now enshrined in European law. We have the emission trading system. We have the expansion of the emission trading system, the ETS2. Nevertheless, what I would expect that to be very fair, we have record budgets for subsidies now. Will that sustain? No, not at the level we have, because sooner or later we need consolidation. But why are we investing so much money? Because we want to speed up the energy transition and we want to counteract the recession. I mean, the government 2 weeks ago announced a package for the building sector, which has green aspects, but it's good to combine green, with economic consideration. So I would say more or less we are on a path, and we won't revert that path. Concerning the speeds and the instruments, that might be susceptible to political changes. One last word. Yesterday I had a discussion with some guys who are doing a survey on industries in all over Europe. And they asked the industrial, not the Chamber of Commerce, but the enterprises, what they think about the energy transition, and 75% of the respondents say it's the most important thing for us to stay in Europe is to increase the speed of energy transition. And it's quite clear, we will only have energy-intensive industry here in Austria, here in Europe, if we have green, secure, affordable, renewable energy. No one will invest in a blast furnace anymore. Everyone is going to invest in green.
Mr. Cotoni, from a European point of view, we have elections for the European Parliament upcoming, a lot of elections around Europe. Do you agree? Is this uncertainty from this political uncertainty maybe a bit overrated?
I would totally subscribe to the last sentence statement made. The green transition is there to stay, and we as the European Investment Bank Group, we will continue to support this. Just to make a statement, the European Investment Bank already well before 2022 has committed it fully to Paris. And what that meant is that we internally have committed to what we call the Climate Bank Roadmap, which means by 2030, we as the European Investment Bank will make investments which allow the mobilization of 1 trillion euros, so 1,000 billion euros by 2030, going into green finance. And we are well on track on this. If I look at the numbers just this year, at the end of 2023, we have mobilized under this scheme 350 billion. So we are well on track. Literally out of the 88 billion of last year's commitments and contract signatures, 55% went into the green financing. And when I say green finance, not only the production, it's a renewable production, be it wind, water, solar, biomass, but also obviously storages. Unfortunately, and here I must open a parenthesis for Austria, you will see our absence in the infrastructure, in the grid investments, which is to do with a ruling back in 2019, which has created some problems for us of our counterparts to seek our investment in infrastructure and grid investments. But the green transition, and I guess Deborah made this very important point, we are lagging behind globally when we talk about innovation and technology leaders, but we are leading in green innovation. And that is important. So we are still ahead, but we need to push this further. And this is also why our new president, Calvino, not only that she has clearly stated when she took over the helm of the EIB group, that we will consolidate our green investments, but we will push enormously in innovation, research and development to keep this edge which we still have when it comes to green innovation. So all in all, Europe will stay committed, but one thing is quite obvious. We must never lose sight. We will have to think of how to reindustrialize Europe, which are these sectors, how to support and secure our supply chains, how to onshore or friendshore our supply chains. In this respect, the EIB will also work strongly hand in hand with the Commission, also with the Resource Act, so the Critical Resource Act. There has been talk about our potential role in defense and in nuclear, but primarily we are green investment, innovation, digitalization, and also Deborah has mentioned this, we are critical and we will stay committed to the social impact. So that means schooling, hospitals, social and affordable housing remain critical for us. And here I close the parenthesis, I guess this can only be achieved if indeed our little efforts remain valid when it comes to the Capital Markets Union. We will never ever raise the capital which we need to successfully transform Europe without private investors. And this is also why, and I guess you said it before, the big question in Europe is grant the solution to the problem, so subsidies, or are financial instruments which allow to drag along private investments are the solution. And we are strongly within the EIB group, we are convinced it can only be financial instruments. You will always have areas in research and development where grants have they are justified. But in the overall market-oriented investments, you should and you must support with financial instruments. And that also includes talking about the green transition, the agriculture sector. We have to rethink new. And that is critical. If we can't get this going with this new commission and latest with the new MFF, multi-annual framework, we will potentially get stuck halfway. And that is a critical message.
Ms. Angelo, another very important sector in reducing greenhouse emissions is public transport. The EU states are willing to invest about 500 billion euro until 2030, only in railway infrastructure. Italy has proposed a model of some kind of public-private partnership, meaning investments not only by the state, but also by private companies to renew the infrastructure. Do you think this is a good idea?
Yes, let me first of all thank you for the invitation and for the participation here today. I just would like to not answer your question right now, but to pick up one point, because I think Hubert just said green transition is here to stay, and I couldn't agree more. But I think one thing is very important, and I'm very happy that Jürgen is so an optimistic public administration. So it's very, very good to say that. But I think what is important is if the green transition is going to become a success, you have to invest in grids. That's also what Deborah just said when she mentioned the question of the importance of the grids for internet, of course, but also grids for electricity, and the grid for, of course, for the railways. But grids, and I think that's also an important thing, they are, I would say, natural monopolies. So there are, of course, people in the audience, two professors from my former university. They are more able to speak on the question of how to price natural monopolies. But you all know whom I'm addressing to. But I think it's important to see that there is, of course, a government investment, which is very important. So I think the EU Commission just had an investigation, or just made a study where it showed that about 70% of the investment, of course, in all the railway sector is a public investment. And it's true, of course, for Austria also. So I will come to your question. Knowing this, we face some public-private partnership investment in Europe. We see, of course, and we discuss it quite honestly with our French colleagues, the question of the TGV. You see a very good net with very high prices, but what about the areas between the TGV points? Of course, Paris-Lyon is one thing we all like to travel with, yes, but there are a lot of people living in the countryside and in other parts, and the grids there, or the net, is in a horrible, really horrible state. And sorry to say, it's the same with Germany. It's why we face these problems, because they haven't invested for a long period in the railway sector, and that's really one thing we have. That's part of our challenges we face. Of course, we are so dependent from our German colleagues. I always say they're of course best performer in soccer, but when it comes to the railway question, I think. So I think that's, of course, then you can develop certain parts and certain relations with public-private partnership, but not all of that. It's an important thing, but not all. We face, Deborah just said it before in the presentation, a lot of obstacles in our sector to develop the railway sector. Of course, first of all, it's the skill shortage. It's really one important thing. We invest a lot of money in our formation of for people, for the people working for us. We also, of course, face other obstacles. We had I would say the railway sector is a very much national thing, which are very much limited within the frontiers. That's a problem, because it's not easy to make really cross-border to travel cross-border. And another thing, I think, because we just heard about the reasons why there is a shortage in investments, of course, it's the question of CO2 price. It's the question of skill shortage. I have to say, and I know I have to say it in this surrounding, it's of course also a question of interest rates. Sorry to say, but I mean,
we will talk about that in particular.
Okay, just want to, sorry. But it's as far from an enterprise view, of course, it's very important. And of course, I'm also concerned, and now coming back to the question of an optimistic public administration, I'm also concerned to the necessity of investing in grids and in the transition versus the effect of fiscal rules at the European Union. And then coming back to the question, do we come to the next years where there is more attention paid on budget deficits than on the need of investment in green transition? It's a little bit a concern, of course, but it's, of course, due to my business.
Let me stick to one point you just mentioned. This is the cross-border investments in public transport. I will now quote from Mr. Felbermayer's recently published book, Europe Must Pay Off, which says, above many other things, that the EU member states have invested 0.0119% of the GDP in so-called cross-border infrastructure. So do we need more coordination and, of course, more investments and funds for international infrastructure projects so that, for example, trains and traces are equally new and equally fast on both sides of a border within a actually united Europe?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when we invest in our tunnels, that's an investment for the European Union. That's Brenner Basistunnel, of course, because we do it together, but also Koralm and Semmering and all this. That's an investment for the European Union because it's for of course, cross-border transportation of goods. And that's important. If we want to achieve the goals and the goals of we need to arrive at net zero, we have to shift transportation from the roads to the railways, of course. I think that's, and mobility, you just mentioned it in the beginning, that's one of the important questions really to reduce the CO2 emissions. That's the crucial point. And if we don't have this, we have in Austria an investment plan based on a picture for the next 10, 20 years. If we don't have things like that all over Europe, I don't know how we will develop our net. And of course, to develop the net, if you know you need 500 billion euros within the next years, and you only have 28 billions via the CEF, so that doesn't work for the countries which don't have the money to really invest in this structure.
So, Mr. Felbermayer, as I quoted from my book, how can this be achieved? How can this be done? More cross-border, bigger projects, so, EU-wide investments?
I think there's something very important that you said, Mrs. Angelo. We're talking about public goods in many dimensions. First, of course, public infrastructure nationally, but it's public infrastructure at the union level. So when we invest, this lowers transportation costs or net security. We talk about electricity nets also for our neighbors. And the way that we usually deal with public goods is by having government money invested in this. So I'm relatively certain that there's an important complementarity between public and private funds, but there will be a lot of public funds that need to be invested. And when we talk about cross-border, then we have this common European public good that requires a common European investment. I think it's great that the EIB is here because Europeans will be looking for you, given that national budgets are constrained, in particular in the biggest EU economy now, Germany, with a debt break, given limitations in many southern countries. Now, Austria may have some leeway, I guess, but not endless neither. So we need to find the money at the European level and the European capacity also to put the infrastructure on the ground, because the money is not the only thing we need. We need to make sure that it is invested in the right places. You mentioned the Brenner Basis tunnel. This is a great thing. But if the Germans don't build the infrastructure that leads to the tunnel, we are in troubles. I have a nice map that shows I'm sorry about being a bit nasty to the Germans, but it shows the German high-speed train system. It's great. They have a couple of lines, only a few, where they really run their trains at 200 plus. And those are in this map colored red. So some parts of the Munich-Berlin link are red, Frankfurt-Cologne or Mannheim-Cologne is red, and so it's a little bit of red, not much. There's a little bit of orange. This is where they run their trains at the 200 or so. And then there's gray. This is the system that comes from Emperor Wilhelm's times. And you can really look at the border regions. They're all gray. There is no high-speed investment in border regions. A little bit in the west. Now they're building Frankfurt-Basel. So there's something happening, but very little. And this is systematic. We've studied that. It's true for railroad infrastructure. It's true for road infrastructure. It's true for gas pipelines. It's true for electricity nets. We have this very nationalistic planning in Europe wherever you go and wherever we talk about network infrastructure. And the only way to overcome this is to put more money at the European level and also to put more planning capacity, political capacity at the European level. I think we can now safely say that the approach of the last decades has failed, not to say that the European Union co-finances projects and puts a little bit of money and then hopes that the public infrastructure spending comes with European objectives in mind. This has not really worked. The money was taken, it was invested in Kassel. Right in the middle of Germany, and the border regions haven't seen much investment. And this is symptomatic, and it is as one economist would expect. This is what rational governments do. They maximize their chances to be re-elected and not welfare of neighboring states. That's not what we do. So we need, I would call it super grids. Super in the sense that they are a level above the grids, the national grids that we have. And we need the European effort there on many levels. And railroads is just one example. And the complementarities with private are very clear. I think when we talk about grids, that's his textbook. I hope my colleagues don't disagree with me. But if you take a standard textbook, what usually economists would recommend is that the physical infrastructure has the feature of a natural monopoly, and that should be state-owned. And governed by, and financed by taxpayers' money. You can debt finance this even, and the operations on that grid then should be organized in a competitive manner. So the railroad ideally, should be, the infrastructure should be state-owned, but then we should have competition by private companies on that infrastructure. And the same is true for all the other infrastructures as well. So that's the textbook model. And in that sense, we need to make the basic investment in the infrastructure, and then hope that private companies will invest in their rolling stock and in the operations and in these things. Now, we talked a little bit about interest rates already. So and of course that's. In this house and for the EIB and also for when you think about how the economy is doing right now, the interest rates are really the high interest rates are really slowing down economic activity and make capital expenditures very expensive. The trouble with the green transition is that we need to build several times the nominal capacity that we would that has sufficed with fossil fuels to guarantee supply security, because of course the wind is not blowing 24 hours a day every day. We only have 8 hours of sun on a winter day or less, and these volatilities require that we invest much more in capacity, and the capacity will very often be idle. No? Very bad for business cases. And so the marginal costs of renewables might be low, because it's true, of course, that compared to the, I don't know, Gazprom or the oil companies, the sun does not send a bill, but we need to put the infrastructure there, we need to put the capex there, and this will be very expensive. And every little tenth of an interest rate makes this more expensive. And so I think the fact that we have now switched from an ultra-low interest rate regime into a regime that is probably, in the medium term, seeing interest rates that are higher, maybe by 200 basis points than what we saw before the crisis. I'm not talking about the 400 we have now, but substantially higher than before. That makes the entire exercise of transition much more expensive, much more expensive. And so, in order to make sure that we handle this, I think we need to understand the complementarity as well. You know, not only infrastructure and the operation of railroads or electricity providers on that infrastructure, but also the interaction with governance at all levels. There are studies that say if we push for a truly single European electricity market, we can save each year something like 30 to 45 billion euros, which are now wasted because we need, the Germans need to stop their wind parks in the North Sea because they can't get rid of the electricity produced there. It's not very often, but it happens. And so with a better governance and the infrastructure that comes with it, we can reduce the capex needed. And because of the high interest rates, this has become imperative to do so. And so last sentence, I think what the next Commission needs to do, and I think we in Austria, in the middle of Europe, we should push the Commission very much for that, is really to get in the big push in the single market. And this is not just the capital market union, that is extremely important, but it's also about an electricity union. It's also about getting those infrastructure investments at the truly pan-European level. So, but it all has to do with the single market. And if I had a wish, I don't want a new Commission that puts geopolitics at the forefront or security or all these things. Yes, of course, too, no? This is important, but we should really get a new push going to get the single market deeper and wider again. I think that is the only real way to deal with the high costs that we are facing, to get the single market to our advantage. And many of those pictures that show EU, China, and Europe in comparison, the big difference is in the EU we don't have a single market. We have something that we call a single market. But Jaume Ventura last year has a paper in the Journal of International Economics. The bottom line is Europe is far from having a single market. We still have enormous internal barriers. The Chinese don't have them. The Americans don't have them. And if we want to have a chance in this, we need to get rid of them. So that's what I think is really important.
Mr. Cotoni, you were noting a lot of times the EIB is funding a lot of those infrastructure projects in the European countries, in the single European countries. But how do you see this problem with cross-border investments? How much do you fund of particular national projects? And in comparison, how much is EU-wide projects really being seen as EU projects with cross-border components?
I'm afraid we are a bit at the mirror of the reality. The European Investment Bank is controlled and owned by 27 member states. And obviously, each single shareholder would like to promote its or her projects in the respective countries. Now, this does not mean that we are not trying to, in particular, on critical infrastructure, and obviously the railways, energy, but also telecommunication are considered critical. We are trying to get the interconnections as part of the design going, and not least for this, we have enormous advisory services. Not to be forgotten that under InvestEU, but also RePowerEU, we have a relatively large advisory buckets which should close exactly that gap. So in other words, to to examine these projects, these individual projects, and bring them closer and make them interconnectable via the borders. That is one of the main objectives of these advisory programs. And they are, as I said, quite substantial. Just to give you a figure, under InvestEU, we have approximately 350 million of advisory capital to be invested to make exactly single projects more effective and more efficient. That this is not easy goes without saying, unfortunately, because the only thing which we have seen in history, the only thing which always goes close to the border is nuclear power plants. And that is... Sorry to say this, but this is the only obvious thing which we can observe. But as was said, in the new Commission, it's really all about making the common market deeper, and I fully agree. It's not only about the capital market, it's just closer to my heart, but it is, goes without saying that all areas needs to be deepened in order to make Europe more efficient. And this is the problem. The cost, if I see a cost of kilometers of railways in Europe, is relatively higher than what we observe elsewhere. And this is one of the problems. We don't have a common procurement. We don't have a common plan, which could indeed generate different cash flows for the repayment of these investments. So they're very isolated and singular. Yes, it's our role. We can't deny this. But at the end of the day, I said, we are also mastered by different forces. And the question is how we can finance the balance.
Mr. Schneider, you wanted to add something to the infrastructure.
Yeah, two points really, I have to say. I mean, the electricity grid is underinvested, but this is not a problem of financing. I mean, you know, financing in the electricity grid, that's predictable cash flow. There's basically very low risk, much lower than other investments, much lower than in production. The problem we have is a regulation which was set to bring down costs. Now we are making new legislation to oblige also the distribution network operators to have 10-year development plans, and we will see that investment. That's not a problem. It's much more difficult for hydrogen. If we want to ramp up a hydrogen infrastructure, we will need public money. Why is that the case? Now we have a chicken and egg problem. We have production. No one knows the production cost. We have off-takers who can't make the investment decision until they know how much they get at which price. We have no infrastructure. And for that, we really need public interventions, and we are quite closely working on it. I mean, I agree, the interest rate is so important for renewables because they are capital intensive. Very low running costs, but very high upfront costs. And one thing I'm really tempted to say, and I think the governor is not here anymore, he said we might be provocative. We're talking about infrastructure and natural monopolies, and we have to be efficient. If you have a vision of being technologically neutral, that means you have 5 infrastructures in parallel. That creates exactly the uncertainty we heard from Deborah. Talking about e-fuels is about creating uncertainty, making an environment where investments are not made in Europe but in China. That's exactly the wrong way to do. If you have a natural monopolies, we have to keep the cost of the energy transition low, and we need technological certainty. We need some sort of planning, otherwise the investment won't come.
I find it's important to understand here. It's true that finance is there, so it's not that the savings in Europe are not sufficient to finance these big projects. And I'm also confident that our banking system, if we allow it, here's the capital market unit that's important, will be able to mobilize those savings and channel them into those investments. But what I'm worried about is, for example, on the grids. In Austria, we probably need 30 billion euros investment. Yep. Now divide that by the number of households in Austria, and we're talking about something like 8,000 euro you know, that a household, a single household, has somehow to digest. Now, the question is not so much about the risk in a given regulatory environment, you know, where indeed the APG, the long distance electricity distributor, will make money given that regulation, but it's more that voters will say, are you completely crazy? Do you really want me to pay those 8,000 euros over maybe 10 years? You know, and the way we have it today is to put that money on the electricity bills. That will be very hard. So I guess again we will need the government here, you know, to fund a large part of the grid costs. Because I fear that even if we have the funding available and the financial instruments and all that, we should not count on the regulatory environment to be constant. I can easily imagine a government here and in other places in Europe that says we don't do that, and we need to prepare. And I think part of it must be that the grid needs to be directly financed by government, and not the attempt to burden households or even businesses. I mean, Germany businesses are largely exempt from the network costs, you know, because of international network considerations. I think we shouldn't do that. And I'm sure, you know, if you have to carry those costs too, as enormous electricity consumers, that will push prices up and be meeting public unhappiness. No.
No, I think I can agree to you very much. I think the difference between, as far as I know it, but of course you're more specialist in it, the question how to finance the grid development between the electricity sector and the railway sector, that's really a huge difference. And I'm sure it's really because of the need we have to develop our electricity grid now, when it's all given to the households, and that's the way we now charge. We charge the households with the huge part of financing the electricity grid, and it's completely different to how we finance the development of a railway grid. We spend about 3 billion euros a year, thanks to government investment, to improve our railway grid, and we only receive 10% of it via the fee we receive from the railway undertakings, because they couldn't afford it. I mean, I have to just to add something to the question of the textbook model. I would sometimes like to challenge it with the reality, because I know the textbook. But if you see, I mean, there are for competition, what is interesting is Wien-Salzburg. Yeah, that's for competition, that's interesting. But the rest of Austria, perhaps it's in Wien-Linz, perhaps. Yeah? But the rest, of course, is not really for competition, because there is a need, a public need, to run this connections. I mean, Wien-Baden and Wien-Mödling, most of the people traveling by railways, 80% are traveling less than 30 kilometers. So there's a public need, because you need to go to your work and something like that. So the question is, we have a lot of effort to make the reality become more like the textbook. There are a lot of people working really in the regulation sector, a lot of lawyers, a lot of other people, and they are earning good money, so that reality is a little bit developing via textbook. I think I'm not quite sure if it's worth the effort.
If I can, I think between your position and mine, there is no contradiction, because we can have a lot of public subsidies on, let's say, commuting, and have competition. So how contracts are awarded could be organized in auctions, and this is more or less how it already happens. No? So I think the elements are there. what I wanted to say is, of course, the textbook is the textbook. No? This is how we teach in 45 minutes, you know, the problem that we can solve in 2 lifetimes. No,
but that's our reality. That we have the textbook. That's something which is really interesting, because you have the textbook and we face it as reality. And now the reality has to adapt to the textbook. That's something which is really interesting.
I'm really sorry, I have to interrupt your vivid discussion because time is rushing. Let's stick to another problem we are facing right now, and this is our economic surrounding. We have had a few quite tough years from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, and your forecast for 24 doesn't really look good either, Mr. Felbermayr. So what impact, again to all of you, do you think this weak economic growth, this really struggling European industries, in particular Austrian industries, might have on investments in new grids, in renewable energy sources, in infrastructure? What do you think?
Yes, so
I'm looking at you because you're forecasting.
Yeah, on the 22nd of March,
yes.
we'll be presenting the results. We have seen the IFO, I think 2 days ago in Germany, come up with their spring forecast, and they talk about 0.2% in Germany. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, Marcel Fratscher from the German Institute of Economic Research in Berlin even talked about a red zero, so recession for the year 24 in Germany. We'll see what I can tell you in 10 days or so when we present the forecast, but it will certainly not be the 0.9 that we had in our forecast in December. So this is how fast things change. No, it's not a funny business right now, not doing those forecasts and being forced to change all the time. No, I'd rather not have to do it. But what does it mean? Well, it means that the need for reform, the need for also public involvement in this is bigger than it was before, no? Because we have cyclical issues that have to do with interest rates, high interest rates, but also have structural problems that bring down those growth rates, in particular in Germany, but we're not much better in Austria. And so I think what one could conclude from these weak numbers is that we need more decisive action, really get this single market program going. I think this must be our growth agenda for the next years. Make sure that the infrastructure investment that we need is put in the ground. I guess that could be a conclusion from it. And we should not, given those weak numbers, overly rely on the private sector. No? Because the weakness is there because of weak private sector investment. Now, let's repair the conditions so that the private sector invests more, but the weakness is because of a lack of cross investment from the private sector.
Let's stick a little bit to the interest rates. They have risen quite a lot within a quite short period of time in order to combat inflation. Do you think those higher interest rates now are slowing down certain projects, not only economic growth, but also within the area of renewable energy, of investments by companies needed for those projects?
Yes, absolutely. And this is what they must do. No? I mean, again, sorry about the textbook, but that's what they're meant to do. No? They are there to slow down aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is consumption and is investment. Investment is very sensitive to interest rates. Of course it is. And the very capital-intensive renewables business, of course, is slowed down by this. There's no doubt. We don't observe the counterfactuals, so the what if interest rates had not gone up by those 400 or so basis points, no? But the effect is quite clear. I guess the banker will see that similarly.
Exactly. So how does the banker see it, Ms. Morales?
The banker expects, and this is good news, at least a decrease of the interest rates by 75 basis points till the end of the year. So I hope this will...
Mr. Holzmann is gone, so we can ask this
I know
now.
there are some different opinions around. Yes, no, definitely. We see an issue in the demand for financing structures. This is clear. This is the textbook, as you said. But we do see that 2025 will improve, and we come up with 0.3 GDP growth in Austria and 0.5 in Europe for this year. This is at least our assumption. But for next year, we are by far more positive. Yes. But I am not from the financing side. I am from the investment side, and therefore, for sure, there are more competent people to discuss this topic with.
Well, then let's stick a little bit to the investment side. In recent years, we have seen a boom in green bonds, green investments, green financial products. UniCredit, for example, has been quite successful in placing them. I think 3 years in a row, a green bond. How are they performing right now in this economical surrounding? And are we witnessing probably a bit of a green balloon or a green bubble right now from the investment side?
Yes. As you mentioned, we launched 750 million this year, our third green bond, now in total 2 billion, and we have been 3 times oversubscribed. So this is really, again, a success, and the demand from institutional investors is still there and also will continue to be there, at least in Europe. Why I say at least in Europe? Because in the US, I don't know if you know, but there are already tendencies or some states that are, for example, prohibiting ESG investments in pension funds, for example. So this is something that is quite weird, and it's also a little bit frightening at the moment. When it comes to the private investors, I have to say that we see a drop in ESG investments in the demand. We had a big push in demand throughout 2021, but 22 didn't help us. Why? Because all asset classes were negative, so bonds, equities, and the only asset class being positive was raw materials. Yeah. And for sure in ESG investments, this was not part of the game. And therefore, we saw an underperformance of ESG-related investments to so to say, non-ESG-related investments. This and also compared with the, or in pair with the greenwashing debate leads to a little bit of drop in sensibility of private investors for ESG, which is, from my perspective, will not lead to a green bubble, or there is definitely no green bubble. But yesterday we discussed maybe one thought in the Fund Congress in Messezentrum that the year before everybody talked about ESG and today nobody. And my answer was maybe we should stop talking about ESG but just doing it. So I think there is no alternative. There is simply no alternative. If you want to manage the challenges we have ahead, this is it. And we must not also misuse this topic for political, I don't know, interests.
Let's stick to the political interests. ESG, this is it. Is it also it for the government right now?
Well, I mean, I agree to your observation, and we had a very difficult year 22. I mean, let's be very honest, but the reason for that was, I mean, we saw that fossil fuel prices skyrocketed. That means that certain companies made a lot of money. And I mean, our net balance sheet for fossil energy in 22 as a Republic of Austria was minus 18 billion euros. 18 billion euros. And normally it's about 10 billion, 8, 9, 10 billion. So 22 was 80 million, and we know in which pocket the money landed. I mean, we know that also war was financed with some of their revenues. So that would be something really to another good reason to speed up with the energy transition. I mean, also the Republic has issued a green bond that was also a success. And it's also an interesting learning procedure, you know, to get all, you know, to all the reporting and all that stuff. I mean, I would, and we see also by private customers some reluctances in difficult times to be more sustainable with their investment. Nevertheless, also here I would argue the train is running. There are some ups and downs, yes, and I wouldn't neglect it. I mean, we have to be very transparent about that. But I'm deeply convinced also now with the taxonomy that's really the new normal. There will be some setbacks, but I think we'll be on track, and we're also happy that our Ministry of Finance is, you know, looking at this green public spending. What is the effect of the public money doing, and not only in our budget, we know it quite well, but also in the budget of the other ministries, to see if there are also harmful expenditures. So there is an up and down, yes. Nevertheless, I think there is no alternative to the transition, and it's also good to remind ourselves. I mean, where the biggest investments in renewables are done, they are not done in Europe. They are done in China. I mean, I've seen a recent publication by International Energy Agency on investments in renewables in new 5 years. And for China, they had the y-axis was on a different scale because it's 5 times Europe. There's also good news to that. I mean, we have issues with supply chains with solar in 22. Now the prices are falling again. I mean, due to different reasons, which makes it difficult for production. But for the global climate, it's a good news because it's really costs are going down. We have high capacities. Nevertheless, we have the discussion about strategic autonomy and also leave at least some production also here in Europe, which is difficult enough.
One more question to you, Ms. Morales. How important are those already mentioned uniform standards in EU taxonomy, and how are you dealing with greenwashing? We've had quite a debate on that in the last years.
Yeah. No, let's start what we are doing and then explain how taxonomy is really supporting this whole transition. When it comes to ESG, we have quite clear criteria defined. Yes, and we have also our independent advisory board consists of scientists and economists and entrepreneurs that are advising us in how to do best, because this is not that easy to understand all the mechanisms that have to be considered. And based on that, we are then screening the assets, so the companies and also the states where we want to invest. And for this screening, it is super important to have this taxonomy in place because it increases transparency, it sets standards, it avoids that everybody is misinterpreting something. One asset manager does see it like this and the other like that because he has a different source of information. So this is something that we are very much supporting, and I'm very happy that we go in this direction with the EU taxonomy. We are for sure at the beginning, we have for sure to learn a lot together with our companies, but it's definitely the right direction. And on greenwashing, yes, we have to be very strict. We have to have monitoring processes in place. We have to be really, when something like that happens, very consequent that adequate measures are set. And therefore, we are also ourselves. We have regular audits from the EQ label because we are all our investment funds are are, so to say, with the EU or Austrian eco label, where you have regular audits. And I think trust is in this regard one of the most important things when discussing with private investors.
Mr. Gottoni wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to highlight that approximately 1/3 of our business, and I mentioned the 88 billion last year, goes into intermediated finance. That means that we are providing guarantees of funding to commercial banks, also public banks. And here, the coordination and the common understanding of ESG and taxonomy is critical. Not least because on the other end, on our borrowing side, we have to evidence what is green or social, and which we put into the market is indeed green and social. So therefore, the taxonomy indeed is a good dictionary, it's a good guide where to go and how to interpret, but at the end of the day, it's the partners, it's our partner banks, in this case UniCredit, which is one of the most important financial institutions in Europe for us, that we speak the common language, that we get the proper reporting, which we can audit ourselves in order to issue green bonds with those underlying assets which are generated out there in the commercial banking network. And equally for social bonds, which we have in the market. So that is very critical. On the interest rate, I would like to reiterate one point, which is, again, essential to the EIB. Interest rates are important, everybody talks about. But what is equally important is the duration concept, i.e. the question, do we have adequate long-term financing for our infrastructure projects? I.e. can we match the underlying cash flows, be it with grace periods, be it with duration concepts? And that is often underestimated. And in the infrastructure investments, we see this more and more becoming a critical issue because financial institutions do not have access to long-term borrowings. And this is where we come in. And this is also where we can bridge a lot of gaps in the infrastructure. So for us, going 30 years, I'm not saying it's peanuts, but it's almost peanuts. But in particular, matching the cash flows of the underlying projects, this is something where we can, with our financial engineering tools and our capabilities in the refinancing markets, really add a lot of value. Last, not least, when we look at our borrowing, this last year we have done 50 billion, the year before 40 billion, so they are fairly sizable, these amounts which we issue every single year. We have seen, obviously, after or with 2022, a shift in our investor base. We used to have approximately 26% before 2022 in China, which is dropping down to approximately 15% right now. But thanks God, there is sufficient capability and capacity in Europe to pick up the gap. And that is good news. So there is investors' confidence in these, in our case, very often green bonds and social bonds to be placed successfully here in Europe.
Mr. Felbermayr, last question to you, but do you see enough capacity in Europe to face the competition from China and from the US?
So, first, well, this is a couple of layers, I think. One layer is the capital market, and I think, yes, absolutely. I mean, Europe is running and has been running current account surpluses over years, and this means that there is more savings than we have investment, and that we should be able, even if China doesn't play ball with us, or even with a more hostile international environment, we should be able to fund our investment needs, and that's one element. No, that's good news. Of course, if you look at the world as it's evolving and geostrategic tensions rising, this does not make the decarbonization exercise easier. We are happy now to have a relatively large supply, let's say, of solar panels from China at low prices. That helps us. But of course, it also cements a situation that many feel is problematic, because we don't have any proper manufacturing of this. So, how to ride this trade-off is devilishly difficult, because the risk is that we are vulnerable to disruption, as the situation is now, with tensions with China maybe going up more, and they already are. the same time, building up a capacity at a higher price is not helping the transition. So, and these trade-offs are everywhere, and it's just politically something that needs to be decided. Not so much for the experts. It's a trade-off between security and costs. We can say let's be more secure, but then we have to say, as with as investment, we have this risk-return trade-off here too. We can be less risky, but then we have to shoulder the higher costs. And how to get that down with the taxpayers, with the users of infrastructure, will require political leadership. This is nothing for economists. We can map the trade-off, but the decision where we want the society to be on this risk-return trade-off, this decision is a political one.
Ms. Angela?
Yes, perhaps I just want to make 3 short remarks. First of all, I like the expression taxonomy is the new normal. I think that's very important because, of course, we have as an enterprise a lot of reporting duties according to this. But on the other hand, it's, I think, very important that now I'm in rounds with other CFOs, and that CFO discuss sustainability. That's really one important thing so it comes to the enterprise, and I think they are going to develop a lot of good measures. Normally, CFOs are not the most creative parts in an enterprise, but and that's good. So, but yes, it comes to the statistic, it's good. But oh no. But I think that's important, so that it really this question really comes into the heart of an enterprise. The second thing, I would also make a point to the question of duration. That's very important point. I mean, if we see the depreciation period of a tunnel, it's 150 years. And even if we have very optimistic prospects according to our life expectations, nobody is going to prove if it's true or not. So it's really a very long period. And we have grants for, that's the so-called Austrian 10-year Bundesanleihe. I don't know how it's called in English, but it's for 10 years, so it doesn't match. It's not really. It's why, I don't know. And the third thing, the question of China and how to compete with China. When it comes to the railway sector, we have in Europe a really very high industry standard in the railway sector. We have a lot of enterprises doing a good work, to the trains, but also in other relations in the railway sector. But we have, of course, the question of competition from China, and it's because they invested a lot in this sector in China, because they had really, I think, 5 areas where they invested a lot, and they detected that the railway sector is one thing. They want to go to Europe with their industries, with their products. And I think, coming back to the question of textbook, if we stay in Europe with this thinking of we have to provide competition all over Europe, and not to be or become a little bit, I have to say this word, sorry, become a little bit more protective via other economic areas, I think we will lose this competition, and we will lose a lot of knowledge, and we'll lose a lot of skilled workers. That's my fear, to be honest, because China did a completely different kind of industry policy, and Europe is really very much on the textbook of competition.
Very strong words. A good moment to ask you, this is my final question, to ask you to take a qualified but still look in a glass bowl. From your perspective, what do you think and what is your forecast concerning, keeping in mind all we have spoken about today, regarding the green transition and into a greener path. 1 year from now, where do we stand regarding capacity and investments? Ms. Angelo, do you want to?
In the railway terms, 1 year from now is nothing. That's today.
Okay.
But we are, of course, we will.
You can also look 10 or 100 years forward.
No, but 10 years. I think what is important that our sector is going, and that's we are going to doubling the efficiency of our railway sector in Austria by 2040. So that's a compromise, perhaps.
Mr. Felbermayr,
1 year, 10 years, 1,000 years?
how far does your look in your glass bowl go?
So in the short run, I'm worried. In the long run, I'm more relaxed. So I think the green transition will happen because the business case is there. And the fact that China goes into it is positive for us. Now, it has this negative competitive, we need to discuss that. I'm not completely against what you said, but I think that is something that will happen. No? But in the short run, I'm looking at the discussions we are having in Austria, at the European level, in the United States. There's a backlash against the green thinking, and I don't think it's durable, but it's there, and it will put delays to things. No? So I'm worried, for example, about the integration of the domestic carbon pricing scheme, housing and transportation into the European ETS, because the European ETS now it's what, 60 euros the ton of CO2, but it's supposed to be at 200 or so, to make a difference. I don't see this, to be translated into the domestic carbon market with the preferences of the population right now. So that, yeah, I guess that's it. Though the short run, not pessimist, but let's say, we need to be cautious and not overly optimistic. But in the medium to long run, it's I think the rationale, money-wise, is there, and then markets will deliver if states provide the regulation that's needed and the infrastructure.
Morales, banks are balancing year by year, so how far does your look in your
we as a bank, we have clear targets. So we are also part of the Green Finance Alliance. So there I have no doubts. But when I'm totally with Mr. Felbermayr, when it comes to the overall sentiment of our transition and the discussion I do here, then I'm also in the short term a little bit worried. And I think we have to be more bold. And as said, it's not an ideological discussion. It's just a need that we do have. We have to change. This is nothing that is depending on if I do see the world left or right or whatever. It's in all our interest that we are changing and that we take it seriously, and this common understanding. So this is that this is something we all should have in common. This is something that I'm missing.
Mr. Cottoni?
When it comes to European Investment Bank, we stay committed to our 2030 target, as I mentioned before. So that means that approximately 50% and slightly over 50% of our annual new signatures in the region of 80-90 billion will go into the green transition. And be it this energy efficiency measures, be it renewable energy measures, widely spread. Where I'm a bit more concerned about, and this doesn't depend on now Mr. Felbermayer's guesstimate for this year, be it 0.2 or 0.9 or anywhere in between. We see the world this year indeed a bit more pessimistic. But what we, and not least, I guess I should say that way, not least, because one of the big gaps which we haven't really talked about today, and Deborah did show a couple of slides in her presentation, which are really of major concern, is skilled labor force. Here the efforts need to be really scaled up enormously at all, literally everywhere, not only in Austria. So the skilled labor force is an issue, and the other one is obviously the social gap. How do we address this one? So obviously infrastructure, not only affordable and social housing, but in particular schools, health sector, need substantial investments in order to somehow mitigate the gap, which is enormously widening. And putting this in perspective of this super election year between European election, national election, and American elections, doesn't really, in the short term, give me a lot of hope. But the most important thing is, and being a true European, I would just hope that in June, in particular, the young generation goes to elect and puts a vote down. That is the most important thing. We have to mobilize young European to vote in June in order to make this Europe great again. I guess we need a drive in the right direction, and only the youngsters can give us this vote.
You can clap if you want to. So you were just starting. Mr. Schneider, your final remarks.
Well, I won't repeat what the previous speakers say, because I really subscribe to that. I mean, the geopolitical tensions don't help for multilateralism. That's very obvious. I mean, we had a meeting in Nairobi 2 weeks ago on a global plastic agreement, you know, and half time of a meeting, you have formal things. The Ukrainian delegation say something, the Russians go out, and under UN you work in consent. That makes it really difficult, really difficult. The second thing, I'm a little bit afraid of nationalistic and populistic attitudes we are seeing, not only in Europe. I mean, we see them all over the world. Nevertheless, we have drivers. I mean, there are some very sad drivers. I mean, a couple of days back, we had a meeting of ministers at the European level. Our Greek colleagues said last year they had climate-related damages of 1.5% of their GDP. That's the floodings and the wildfires. And it's not going to stop. It's going to get worse. I mean, if you look at the temperature, if we look at the ocean temperature, so the pressure will be there. I subscribe to what what I see on the European level. On the last Green Deal, it was really the climate movement. Now we're talking about just transition. And they talk about competitiveness for industry. And I really subscribe to that. That's the same content, but the narrative changes due to the bigger situation. So there will be setbacks. In the long run, I'm optimistic, but I mean, we are all here to do our best to make that investment happen. And we have technology, we have a knowledge, so there's no reason why we should not be able to proceed.
Thank you very much for debating with us. We have 20 more minutes. This is why I would like to open the stage for our listeners online and in here. Thank you. There has been a hand. Second one, I propose we collect those two questions. Please, you can also address them directly to our panelists. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the debate. Since there has been so many allusions to the textbook, I cannot resist to ask a textbook question myself. And I think most of us who are economists know that sustaining a healthy climate will be a public good. Because if I invest in climate, then I cannot exclude any of you to benefit from that. And since we know that public goods do not really produce private returns in a sufficient manner, I always wonder why we expect the private sector to come forth with so many of the necessary investments. And then we have heard also today that there will be, whether numbers are 400 or 500 or 600 billion additional investments needed per year. Usually in these policy debates, you always have a number like half of it or 2/3 of it should come from the private sector. But I really wonder what would be the incentive for the private sector if you cannot produce the private returns on these investments. And if I may, a very brief second question to Marion Morales. Like 5 years ago, we had this debate on green bonds and green financing instruments, and there was a concern that the markets for these green instruments is not liquid enough, and therefore the large institutional investors wouldn't be willing to go into these markets because they want to sell at any point in time, and you have an illiquid market, then you cannot do that. Do you think that the liquidity of the green markets is still an issue? Thanks.
Thank you. One more questions from the audience here, and then we have some questions from online, and then it's your turn.
Franz Nauschnig, European Task Force Carbon Pricing. One comment on financing the transition. First, in the EU, we should have a capital markets union, and we have, for example, in ELEC, we have together with the Commission proposed a paper, which is already published, with concrete steps for going into the direction of capital markets union. And the second question is, we have in Austria for financing grids a very good model, the so-called ASFINAG model, where with a state guarantee we bring the financing down. I was in the German government expert group, the Fratscher Commission on infrastructure financing, and we compared private costs, public-private partnerships with the financing costs of ASFINAG, and it was 200 to 300 basis points cheaper because of this government guarantee. It was proposed. They introduced a Autobank GmbH, but lobbying by the German banks and insurance companies made sure that they didn't get a government guarantee, so that the banks and the insurance companies still could finance it. So do not underestimate the political problems. And a second comment on, you said Europe is leading in the green transition. I cannot agree with this. We are talking with the Chinese and the Americans, and the US tells us with the ERA, the Inflation Reduction Act, where the investment in the US in this green transition is skyrocketing. We are leaving us in the dust with their investments. And the Chinese tell us they are investing in the green transition more than the US and the EU do together. So we are not the leaders. We are left in the dust. And a special question to Mr. Schneider. We had 2 years since we know we have a problem with Russian gas. Only now, we had a Biogas Act coming. It's not even agreed. Why did it take 2 years to have it? And in Austria, biogas is negligible, whereas in other EU countries, it's more than 10% of the gas supply. So not really, how should I say, efficient.
Thank you very much. May I kindly ask you to stick to one question so everybody can get the chance to ask the questions. So the first one was, what incentives do private companies have? Do you want to address your question to someone particular, or whoever feels the need to answer?
Since I am responsible here for taking the blame of textbook simplicity. But you're right, of course. I mean, indeed, the tragedy of the climate problem is that it is a public good, and so national contributions or individual contributions to providing that public good will always be insufficient. That's why we need government action. And government action can take many different forms. So we could have the complete public provision of the public good, as we do, for example, when a bridge over the Danube is built. This is just a public good, 100% financed by the state, run by the state, etc. Or we could create markets to internalize externalities. This is what we do with the emission pricing system. And so there's many ways, but the nature of the problem, you described it quite appropriately. If we create markets, we can bring private money in. It's a question of getting the market design right and getting the incentives right. But I feel, and I said so before, that for certain investments, in particular for those public infrastructure investments, we should have, we should see the state and government as a major player in this, as it always was in history. If you think about this country or even the United States, when the railroad systems were built, there was a lot of private money in the beginning, and then all this crashed. It didn't work. It was insufficient. It went bust. It didn't work. The network nature of the system pulled in the governments at the end in almost everywhere. And then when the infrastructure was there, then we could talk privatization again. But this is maybe not the cycle that we would want to wish for. And one thing that goes into your direction is what Mr. Naschnik says, the ASFINAG model. This is one way, to combine private and private, let's say, mechanisms. The private incorporation, the Aktiengesellschaft, the advantages of this, and a public guarantee. That's one way to align the public and the private interests. And I know about those efforts in Germany, and I also always found the ASFINAG idea a great thing. In a sense, this is what the Germans want with their Sondervermögen. It's not so far away. But yeah, we could have ASFINAG models also for the financing of other infrastructures, not just the motorways. We could have similar structures for the electricity network, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Morales, one question was addressed to you.
Yeah, for social bonds, green bonds, I don't see this issue anymore of lacking liquidity, but there are other instruments for sure. Think about private equity or also closed-end fund solutions that are often linked to specific projects to be funded, and there for sure we have this issue of lacking liquidity, definitely. And therefore for really private investors like my customers, there is only little space to really go into that.
Mr. Cotoni, you wanted to add something?
Just very briefly, I can confirm on the liquidity of our bonds, we don't see a particular issue when it comes to private equity and venture capital. Obviously, being the Europe's largest LP limited partner, we see that there is unfortunately a gap. In particular in the scale-up financing, where together with member states, we are just putting up a large fund of funds in order to close the gap to American and Chinese funds, which can easily raise 1 billion and more. And that causes that a lot of innovative enterprises, literally when they start earning money, go to America because they're picked up by American VC, simply because we don't have the deep pockets on the fund size. Now, talking about innovation, maybe I've misunderstood it, but maybe the question was to Mr. Schneider. We are not leading the green transformation. I guess Mr. Schneider didn't say that. But where we are leading is in the initial phase. That means in the patenting and in the innovation of green technologies. And again, it opens up the big gap when we go commercializing these great ideas and getting them on the ground and getting them into enterprises and into the market. This is where we fail again. But we are leading when we look at patents, relevant patents and innovation, the green innovation. That is very critical. And this is also why we are strongly focusing on further supporting these enterprises, not only to start up, but in particular to scale up in Europe. Last not least, when it comes to the Capital Markets Union, yes, we have our green and social bonds. What I would like to see more of is, for instance, SME securitizations. We do this regularly in the EIB group so that we securitize like-minded loans, so to speak, and these are often green SME loans to energy efficiency measures. These are types of investments which then placed by a proper name like UniCredit, guaranteed partly by ourselves, could very easily stimulate the appetite and give additional liquidity to the securitization market as one element to the Capital Markets Union.
Mr. Schneider, one question was directed to you.
But I start with our responsibilities, obviously, to create a framework where investment in climate-friendly technologies are favorable and where investments in climate-damaging technologies are restricted. And that has several aspects. It starts with regulation, and now in Austria, just 2 weeks ago, a regulation entered into force which bans fossil fuel for new buildings. So you are now not even allowed to apply natural gas in new buildings. We have a CO2 pricing in Austria since October 22. We want to integrate that in the ETS2 in 27. We have a lot of subsidies, possibly, no, I won't go into any details on that.
It would last a little bit.
Yeah. We are trying to remove barriers. We have now developed a law which is called Renewable Deployment Acceleration Act, which I'm really looking forward to discuss politically, because in all the Sunday speeches we hear, permitting procedures are too complicated. We have developed a radical approach with acceleration areas, which really would speed up. I'm very, very curious to see what our colleagues in the federal state says and other stakeholders say to that. Here we will see the proof is in the pudding, how we are going to react. Concerning the, what is really different from a couple of years ago? A couple of years ago, we were talking, well, the project pipelines are empty. Now they're not empty anymore. We see the projects. We have to remove the barriers, and then they're going to be implemented. There are some worst case examples what policy should not do, and I'm looking to Germany. That's, for instance, a discussion on the heating law. We saw that the market for heat pumps collapsed, a technology which is produced in Europe, where we have technological leaders in Europe due to populism. And it's a really worst case example which we saw. Last thing on the Renewable Gas Act. Yes, it took some time to bring that proposal forward. Political discussions are not always easy. There are a lot of stakeholders, and one of the obstacles we have in Austria, one of the challenges, that basically all of the energy regulation which we need, which we want to adopt, needs a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly. And there are different interests and trade-offs in that, but we remain committed, and I see a chance that we adopt also this act in this period, but I wouldn't take it for granted.
Thank you. We have 3 questions from online.
How can we states deliver the transition to net zero when financing by the EIB requires the government guarantee, which is not always forthcoming, as governments do not have this as priority, and it is for the private sector to act?
Okay, we can do them as well one by one. So EIB was asked, and the government.
EIB.
I lose my speaker on that question, sorry. The portfolio of financing within the EIB group is as colorful as colors can be, amongst which we have obviously projects which are state guaranteed or guaranteed by regions. But that is not the exclusivity. We are financing also PPPs, so project financing. We do this with and without guarantees, where we normally insist on guarantees, and this is guarantees from the Commission, is outside Europe. So any activity outside EU 27, be it our intervention in Ukraine, obviously requires, or any other in the southern neighborhood, requires EU guarantees. But if I've understood the question rightly, only a smaller part of our intervention indeed requires state guarantees. It depends very much on the type of infrastructure which we are financing. For instance, ASFINAG, we obviously finance ASFINAG, but without an additional state guarantee because it's inbuilt in the HE structure of ASFINAG. If we look at the OeNB, with whom I don't know exactly when we did our last financing, but that is also not guaranteed. It's a few years back. But so I guess this is a very limited number of projects.
Thank you. The next question, please.
Where can we obtain the transformative investment report?
Okay, this is a short one, I guess, on your homepage.
Yeah,
yes.
Indeed.
This was easy. So one final question from the chat, please, and then one final question from the audience, and then I would like to hand over to Ms. Niesner.
We hear that there is no alternative to transition, but we do not hear who will fund when banks do not lend and the governments are absent. Can the EIB be more active in lending?
I mean, we would love to. Just to give you a couple of figures, our balance sheet size is 600 billion, and we have a capital stock, including retained earnings, of approximately 80 billion, just 76 billion. Now, what is our limitation? Our limitation is the statute. Normally, any bank works on the basis of risk-weighted assets, which we unfortunately do not. We are based on nominal values as opposed to risk-weighted. But again, we are owned by 27 member states. This would require a change of the statute in order to give us flexibility to do more. And indeed, in particular in today's inflationary environment, our nominal impact decreases by definition. In an environment with zero interest, with zero inflation, that's a stable amount. But this is unfortunate impact which inflation brings with it. So at the end of the day, the statutory limit, we are the highest capitalized bank, but we cannot fully leverage it because it is a nominal number as opposed to a risk-weighted number.
Thank you. Sir, your question from the audience.
Michael Getzner, I'm a public economist and working at the Department of Public Finance at Vienna University of Technology. Just a short sort of remark in regard to the importance of the public versus the private sector. We just finalized a study on the investment needs for net zero for Austria. And it turns out that, of course, the public sector has a huge importance in this green transition. Talking to OeNB, plus all the grids, this is all sort of public and even the state sector is involved. And if we talk about energy production, it's always also public enterprises. If we look all the federal and provincial energy producers, this is also public enterprises. And estimating the share of industries, it's probably only 20% of all investment needs we need for this green energy transition. And a final remark, probably, many of these investments are, of course, have a high profitability. And talking about, the public goods example, our first in Linz, they just invested, I guess, 1 billion or so. Jürgen might correct me if I'm wrong, in their blast furnaces. And they had to reinvest until 2030 the blast furnace anyway. Of course, they switched to renewable energy and to electricity. So very many of these investments are profitable, of course, and was just wanted to add that. And maybe one final remark, the largest investments in the private sector are the fleets, so cars, electrifying cars. That's roughly 300 billion until 2040. But the cars will be replaced anyway, so there is not too much an additional investment needed. But of course, the sums are huge, but it always depends what we define as green investments, transition investments, carbon neutral investments, or which investments would take place anyway.
So, does anyone want to add something to those final remarks? Yes.
Very short comment, and you mentioned one very important point, and that's if we speak about additional investment necessities, we always have to look at the baseline. We always have to look at the baseline. That's true for electric grid, that is true for the railways. And if you have, for instance, a mobility sector with a high turnover rate, you will see that the additional investment is there. And we have de-risking instruments for them. For instance, our Electricity Deployment Act is more or less a de-risking instrument because we have a market premium, but under normal conditions, there's no public money involved now because they get their revenues from the market. But we de-risk them from very low prices. If the prices are very low, they get they get the difference between the market price and the price with which they went into our auction. So some sort of contract for difference. And that we have to keep in mind. If you see this huge sum, 600 billion a year, no, it's not compared to zero. And it's not that is something which necessarily involves public money. So we get to get the figures right here.
Thank you very much for listening and for talking to us. Now I want to welcome on stage Birgit Niesner. She's director of the Austrian Nationalbank and will present to you her closing remarks. Thank you very much.
So it is my pleasure to conclude this event for you. I will not try to sum up this very rich debate. I'll try to identify some critical points for you. First of all, my boss, Governor Holzmann, he explained to you why we are doing this today. First, we are a partner of EIB, but secondly, we have our price stability mandate enriched by the duty to pursue green objectives according to European contracts and targets, as long as it does not conflict with our price stability mandate. So there is a clear basis. If ever somebody asks you, why are central banks becoming greener and greener, this is the reason, and very important to stress ever and ever again, because we are also a partner in this big endeavor for our society. From Deborah, I would like to stress the key takeaway that 90% of Austrian firms see uncertainty about future prices and regulations as the main impediment to invest in green technology. That also cannot be said often enough. Of course, on the price side, again, we see some responsibility of the central banks, but we are now in a very volatile world, which is hit by one supply side shock after the other. It makes our business extremely complicated, and that's why it's so important to tame the green transition, to make it more predictable, to have investment, to do business, and to also allow stable macro policy. Thank you, Deborah, for the slide on female labor market participation. It's today the International Women's Day. Also, this cannot be stressed enough that we need more women into the labor market. It will also help on the skill shortage. We cannot afford to waste this potential. Coming to the discussion, I would like to single out three points. One is, and this is still Deborah's presentation, she showed that the energy price shock was particularly acute in Austria. So it was a good start when Mr. Schneider explained to us what were the government measures to mitigate this shock. And it was then EIB's role to complement the national effort with the European efforts. You're handing out money, but in a very smart way. And I also would like to compliment this. There was the national player, there was the multilateral player, and there was the private sector well presented. And then the whole discussion oscillated between money at the national level and money at the European level. It was Mr. Felbermayr who said, we need to put money on the European level, and then invested wisely, not into Kassel. And this is something where we really need this interlinkage between the national and the European endeavors, but also the complementarity between regulatory efforts and money, pure money. It was Mr. Schneider, and you surprised me a little bit. You surprised me twice, but you surprised me with this, that you as the Austrian ministry, you stressed the importance not only of money for the grids, there was a big grid discussion, but really the regulation side, which is so important. Yeah? The second point, which of course I would like to single out, was the very interesting interest rate debate. It is clear it makes investment really expensive. Interest rates will go down. But the thing is, it was then a very rich debate because, first of all, Mr. Schneider was here, you surprised me the second time. There was a reason why we hiked the interest rates. It has to be said in a central bank. Yeah? There was this energy price shock. And it was also a very good debate because Mr. Felbermayr emphasized that, okay, we can now lament a lot about the expensive investment level, but we can be more efficient in investing by, for instance, having European investments again. So it is not only about the money itself, but it has to be done jointly, and, Mr. Cotonnier, it has to be done with the long duration, as you stressed. Yeah? So this was very important, and it was then taken up by, of course, an enterprise like OeNB, things in decades and not in years. Yeah? Third point was, and I can't afford not to mention it, where it popped up several times, the politics of all this. Here I would like to single out the sentence from Mrs. Morales, which I like very much. Green transition to stay and all this, and it is not a matter of where you stand politically, whether you're on the right or on the left side. So we need to fight against the political backlash. We need the young generation, as stressed by you, that make Europe great again will only work with the young people, with the next generation. And yeah, we all know that voters' preferences are distorted into the populist direction, but we still cannot afford not to pursue with the green transition. The number brought, I think it was brought by you on the Greek damage, 1.5% of GDP is, it's without discussion. Yeah. So let me conclude with the third remark on Deutsche Bahn today. I will travel today to Nuremberg, and I was really wondering, why does this train run? And the solution is that obviously they allowed Austrian OeNB locomotive drivers to run the train. Yeah, so maybe this is the solution, to have a little bit more element there. I thank you very much for attending and also staying until now. And I say thank you to the technical team, as always. Thank you to all the participants, and enjoy the lunch with us. Don't run away. Thank you.